Let's turn to Lesson 37, which addresses the question, what key challenges does the United States face in the future? So, take out your crystal ball and tell us, how might the U.S. look in the future? Do you have any thought about that?
I think one of the important demographic changes of the United States will be what is a majority and what is a minority. So this has to do with immigration patterns. So in 1944, the vast majority of immigrants to the United States, over 95%, were from Europe. And in the 1990s and into the 21st century, we have a vast majority of new Americans who are coming from Latin American and Asian backgrounds. So demographically, we're already in the state where sometimes the minority becomes the majority.
It's funny you say that because I was just about to ask how diversity has created new challenges for us going forward.
Well, it depends how we treat diversity. The truth is, diversity, as we know it today, may be different than the diversity of the founders' generation, but it comes from the same root. So when Madison talked about factions in Federalist 10, he was assuming that a large country would have a lot of different ideas about government, and that the government will be healthier because of it, and that we should never shy away from conflict because it's not only built into the human condition, but it's natural in a large and diverse society. And in fact, getting more ideas from more corners of the government, from more corners of the country, and from different populations will fuel what they thought was healthy conflict. And healthy conflict is conflict that slows down legislation, provides a forum for deliberation, and hopefully leads to compromise and more moderate ideas.
So along with increasing diversity, we've had an incredible change in modern technology. How has that affected American civic life?
Well, that might actually have a more negative view. As the textbook talks about, when people get their news and information from more narrow sources, they might not be legitimate sources. They may not be shared sources of information. So going forward, if we have a loss of shared understanding of what is valuable information, then we might have a problem for civic education and civic participation. Do we all, as voters, believe the same facts about the same issues? If we don't, then we might have some kind of fragmentation of the community because we don't even believe, even if we disagree, we have to believe in the same fundamental facts. And if you shop around to find the news sources that are most suited to your opinion tastes, then you're really becoming a much more diverse society, but not necessarily a commonwealth. In other words, we'll be too far apart from each other rather than sharing the same source of information.
So let me ask a question about Americans' expectations of their government going forward. Some of us are afraid of government, some of us embrace government. How might those expectations change, do you think?
Well, as I said before, we have a bit of a tension within our own understanding of ourselves. We think of ourselves as theoretically conservative and somewhat opposed to more government intervention. But operationally, we're very dependent upon government, and we are always seeking for more ways to get assistance. And that's true for lower classes, that's true for middle classes, and it's even true for the wealthy. So we can think about the Wall Street bailout, the automakers bailout, and other ways that corporations actually seek some protections and stability from the government. So at all economic levels, actually, we are a seeking society looking for additional benefits and protections at all times.
Are there major differences between Americans and Europeans' views on government and its role and responsibilities? What are the consequences of these differences?
Well, in most European countries, the assumption is that government should be doing all of these social and economic protections. But they have a different attitude toward it, which is that citizens are supposed to pay for it. So tax rates in Europe are much higher, but the obligations and the expectations are also much higher. Therefore, in most European countries, tuition is either free or very low cost. Healthcare is included as a right of citizenship, as we talked about earlier. And the types of things that private charities do in the United States, like process donations and clothing drives and parent-teacher associations. These aspects of civil society are actually government functions in most European nations.
Why do you think that Europe evolved in the way that it has with its expectation about what government's going to do, and America has not evolved that way? Why is this?
Well, I think it goes to our earlier questions about classical republicanism and the idea of small communities. Although Europe is going through a lot of transitions right now with immigration, demographically, European countries are much more homogenous than the United States. So countries that have a greater tradition of sameness with a similar religious and moral background, as well as similar traditions over a longer and more ancient civilization, they would tend to view their neighbor as themselves. When you have a society as diverse and fragmented as the United States that has long welcomed immigrants, although there's a shared philosophy, that is true, there's not necessarily a shared sense of community where one person should take care of another because they are the same.
Are there major differences between Americans and Europeans' views on civil society and its role and responsibilities?
So going back to Alexis de Tocqueville, Americans are joiners, and we have a very vibrant social fabric in this country and always have about voluntary associations. Those can be clubs as well as political and professional associations. And in Madison's Federalist 10, he talked about how these are factions in some cases, and these factions are actually very healthy because they create a lot of demands for different ideas, and those demands get filtered into the government. In European civil society, the expectations that government should provide so many of these things would make them unnecessary. But there's another side to the European civil society that is very different from the United States, and that is more of a hostility toward private religious organizations. So Europe, in its traditional sense, is much more secular than the United States. And private religious associations and political associations and lobbying based on religious views would be frowned upon and less common in Europe.
What evidence is there of, if any, of a polarization among Americans regarding the role and responsibilities of government?
That's a good question, because we have party polarization, where one group of people who calls themselves Democrats, it has polarization against Republicans, and of course Republicans have polarization against Democrats. Partisan polarization is very different from ideological polarization, and it's the latter part that's much more complicated in recent decades. Is there really a difference today between the two parties on what government should do for individual citizens? If you listen to presidential politics and campaign promises, it seems as if both parties' candidates in 2016 are saying, vote for me, I will make your life better. Vote for me, and you will have better employment prospects. Vote for me, and your tuition will be lowered, or it will be forgiven under certain circumstances. I can take care of healthcare problems. If your job goes overseas, I will try to get it back. These are promises that Democrats and Republicans make, and it's part of our contemporary understanding of the role of government. In other words, there is no pro-government party and anti-government party anymore. Although we sometimes talk in those ways, I do not see a lot of difference between the types of promises that Democrats and Republicans make to the voters about the role of government in helping them.
Can you address how civil discourse can help address the challenges we face? Obviously, there seems to have been an erosion of civil discourse. I think that's fair to say. How can it help?
Well, in the United States, we have always wanted to have debate and deliberation. And this goes back to the Constitutional Convention itself. The 55 delegates who met in Philadelphia in 1787 had differences, but they decided to act civilly toward each other, and they recorded in the convention notes that they had differences, but they kept them in a civil way to the confines of the official conversations. At night, they would socialize together, they were separated from their families, and they had to treat each other with a certain amount of humanity. Throughout the United States history, we have to become aware that uncomfortable differences are there. It's always behind the scenes, and it's often also public, and that's considered healthy and good. We don't want to have a paranoid society where people are afraid to express themselves, and that could lead to secret associations that might plot things against the government. The beauty of freedom of speech is that people should be unafraid. But there is an inconvenience to that, which is that once that there are all of these ideas in the political sphere, we're going to have conflict. That conflict will take time to resolve. We might have compromise, but we might also have stalemate and gridlock because ideas are so different on both sides. So the answer is that civil discourse is very time-consuming, and in the meantime, there are real problems to be solved. Is more talk always the answer? Maybe not, but it's part of our cultural fabric.